This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland.
You're listening to the 5th programme of Giving the Greatest Good, and in this programme we continue our investigation into the remarkable life of Joseph Beale of Mountmellick.
Joseph Beale would have been a Quaker who had a lot of businesses in the town around the time of the famine.
Joseph Beale will certainly be remembered for the work he did for the people of Mountmellick in those sad years.
It was a horrific time in Ireland. It was very, very sad.
And he would have used his own money and his own income to supplement what was being given out to people at the time.
He knew that he was going out on a limb and that he was running himself into ruin, but at the same time he couldn't stand by and see poor people starving to death.
These people were really put their money where their hearts were.
And as long as he had any money at all, and as long as the Quakers could help, they would help.
They saw other human beings who were desperate, who needed help.
He was effectively put out of business, and he was effectively wiped out. His businesses were finished by the time the famine was over.
It can certainly be said that they kept many a family in Mountmellick alive during those desperate times.
I'm Paul Wright and welcome to the 5th programme of Giving the Greatest Good. In our last programme we threw light on the remarkable story of the Quaker businessman Joseph Beale from Mountmellick in County Laois. We heard how, when the Great Famine struck Ireland in the mid-19th century, he kept his businesses operating for as long as he could, in order to give much needed employment when he could easily have averted financial losses by closing them. The end result was that by the end of the famine, Joseph Beale was financially ruined. Now we reached a point in his story where he has decided to emigrate to Australia. County Laois local historian Bridie Dunn.
Most people were going to America at that time, but he chose Australia because being in the woolen business and knowing that Australia had all of the sheep country and the woolen business was big there, he felt that he might make a fresh start. So he decided to bring 2 of his elder sons with him. Now they were only 16 and 15. He also brought a workman with him, Daniel Kennedy, and his son. He was known as a Quaker as well, but he had been a faithful servant. So all 5 of them actually, set out together from Queenstown, which is Cove, of course, and Margaret went down and saw them off, and she remained behind then, trying to sell the bark mills in place, and that was difficult. It proved very difficult, and it took her 2 years before the place was sold up. It was only with help from her father, who sent a buyer to her, that she managed to sell it at a fairly reasonable price, and herself and the rest of the children made the journey to join with them later.
And so in 1852, 2 centuries through the year that Joseph Beale's ancestor Thomas Beale had left England for Ireland, Joseph Beale himself was departing his native Ireland, along with his 2 eldest sons, for a new settlement at the other end of the earth. His wife Margaret and the remainder of their brood would join him down under 2 years later. However, for the moment, Joseph Beale, son of Mountmellick, was finished with the sad hollow-eyed dusk of Ireland. He now sought the bright, chubby-faced morning of Australia, as far away from his beloved Mountmellick as he could possibly go.
Farewell to thee, Mountmellick, dearest town to me. Even in our darkest hour of this land's history, for there are ties that bind me, even until death. It's here, my lovely village, my children first drew breath.
And even though Joseph Beale was now financially ruined and as a result forced through economic necessity to leave his beloved Mountmellick, yet in the prestige of his fellow townspeople he couldn't have stood higher. On the eve of his departure he was presented with a public address, Not the ornate illuminated confection customary on such occasions, but just a simple handwritten document, the best that his impoverished hometown could afford. Mountmellick local historian Ger Lynch.
When he left Mountmellick, he was given an address by the equivalent of the town council at the time. And it was a handwritten address because things were poor enough at the time, and normally in these times it would be an illuminated address. But this was a handwritten address, but made more important by the fact that an enormous amount of people, besides the town council, signed it. Bishops, the Roman Catholic clergy, the Protestant clergy, all those interested in the good of the town, interested in industry. There was an enormous amount of people signed that and gave it to him as a farewell when he was going off to Australia in 1852. So it gives us some indication that then the esteem that the family and that the name was held in.
I hold you ever in my heart.
To Joseph Beale, esteemed friend, we feel it a pleasing duty which we owe you, to express on your removal from amongst us to settle in Australia our recollection of the benefits conferred on the locality from the extensive employment given by you. Your family have been residing here nearly 2 centuries, more particularly in the woolen and cotton manufacture, which, owing to your enterprise and near exertions, were brought to near perfection. We regret that the Great Depression in those branches of trade a few years ago forced you to relinquish a business which, although unprofitable to yourself, diffused the benefit of extensive employment to others, and which period of depression has been succeeded by years of famine and consequent destitution of a large proportion of the population.
When I was in my manly prime, with love on you I gazed. With pride those memories linger still, and time will not erase.
And so we come to the question of why Joseph Beale did so much to help those in his community, to the extent of keeping his businesses running when it was clearly financial suicide to do so. Ger Lynch.
The reason, I suppose, he done this, I mean, he knew himself, he was a businessman. He knew that he was going out on a limb and that he was running himself into ruin. But at the same time, he couldn't stand by and see the people of the country and the poorer people and the people of the area, people that he knew and people who worked for him. He wouldn't stand by and see them starving to death. And as long as he had any money at all, and as long as the Quakers could help, they would help. That was borne out by the fact that only himself and 2 of the sons went, and they were accompanied by a Quaker servant of theirs and his son, and they travelled second class, and there was a vast difference at that time travelling first class and second class. It was an amazing difference, like in the ship, even to the food they got. And on the voyage, I said, the voyage was eventful in as much that he was elected on the voyage. He was elected the mess captain, I think is what they call him, or that. But that he was the one to speak up for the rest of the passengers, and he was elected to that position. So it gives you an idea of the influence he had over his fellow passengers. Even though he was a very quite unassuming kind of a man, it still shone through that he was a man who could lead people and who could fight for people and who would fight for people's rights.
Though I set sail far, far away, your fields and meadows forever stay, locked within my memory, like the turning tide of a restless sea.
But while Joseph was on board ship, he wrote letters, many, many letters to Margaret, and she to him. And when they would stop by at a port, he would have the post done.
Historian Bridie Dunn.
So he did the writing and telling how the sons were getting on and how the Kennedys and so forth, and all of the news from the ship, people that he had met and so on. So I think he was a very sociable kind of man, and he seemed to get in with the captain and was invited to the captain's dinner and made lots of friends on board ship and people who later became used to him when he arrived in Australia.
The turning tide of a restless sea. Upon the Sarah sands I sail to the far-off Tasman Sea. While beggars at the poorhouse wait, I sing in grief for thee. The stormy tempest fills white sails that blow like falling snow. As far from thee, Mountmellick, I am forced to go.
And eventually, after a 3-month voyage on the sailing ship the Sarah Sands, Joseph Beale and his companions disembarked at Melbourne. The year was 1852 and the burgeoning town of Melbourne was in a frenzy since gold had been discovered in nearby Ballarat. It was a million worlds removed from the old country of Ireland. Ger Lynch.
He had left Ireland here, and Ireland was depredation and starvation and famine, and he left in 1852, but still the effects, and particularly the economic effects, were being well felt then. But after his 90-day journey, and the journey itself was eventful enough, but when he arrived in Australia, he arrived in the middle of the Ballarat gold rush. So he was going from one extreme to the other, and when they arrived, they were able to go off the ship and find work, on building roads. I mean, there was a boom in Australia at that time, and they were building roads. The whole colony lake was just developing, and they were in on the very beginning. They got into that work, and with the usual enthusiasm that Quakers and Joseph Beale and his sons displayed. It wasn't long before they had a business of their own going, and they had carts, and they used to truck supplies and stuff to the miners in the mines, and also stones for the roads. They delivered the stones and to build the road. So they had within a month, like, they had a thriving business going. That's how quickly they were able to get off the ground.
Talk about enterprise.
Yes, and the prime mover behind all this was Joseph Beale. Was anxious to get his wife Margaret and their other 6 children across, and this depended on either to get enough money in Australia to be able to send back to bring them there, or that they would sell the remaining property in Ireland, which was Monadree or bark mills.
And he sang as he stowed that jumbuck in his tucker bag, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me."
One of the reasons, I think, as well, why Joseph wanted to go out ahead of Margaret and the children, he intended to have a home set up like that. He liked things to be exact and correct and predictable, and he felt that when he would go to Australia that he would have a home ready for them when they arrived, rather than all of them leaving together, Now, Margaret was under pressure at leaving because her parents were getting elderly and they begged her not to go. And they begged her to stay with the children and all that. So she was torn between the two, but she had a great love for Joseph and she wasn't going to leave him go without her. But it was a bit of a pain to her during the 2 years. So finally her father relented and gave her quite a bit of money to make the journey comfortable for them on board ship.
Bridie Dunn. And sailing from Dublin, Margaret was accompanied by her 6 children, ranging in age from 21 years down to 4. And also by the old family nurse Mary Brophy and her daughter Charlotte. So how did their voyage fare? Mountmellick local historian Dick Fitzpatrick.
Another interesting thing, with that voyage that they took, it was terrifying for them. These people have never left the town of Mountmellick, and suddenly they were on a ship that was travelling to Australia. Weeks on end, the sickness on the ship, the upset, the worry, the strain of not know what was in front of them. Now, fair enough, Joe Beale and his 2 sons had already set themselves up in Australia. But even that, for a young woman to take the other children out there, you can imagine the agony and the nervousness, the terrifying experience for her to get out there. Plus the fact that she was after leaving 3 souls behind, 3 young children had died from fever, like her own flesh and blood. So that was also a terrible thing that they were doing. So there must have been terrible strain on the family and stress.
While Margaret Beale's youngest, little 4-year-old Octavius, enjoyed the motion of the vessel at first and said it was exactly like a cradle, very soon into the voyage, the cradle turned rough and tossed him out of his bunk. Hardships such as seasickness and the shock of deaths of other passengers eased into warmer weather. The magic of islands floating by, Madeira, the Canaries, Tenerife, and the crossing of the line when one of the boy passengers fell overboard and was luckily rescued a mile away. A fever attacked Margaret's 3 youngest infants. Tropical heat followed with calms and later cold weather when the only means of keeping warm was by brisk walking. They saw icebergs and navigated precariously through the floating ice, after which heavy seas crashed into one of the saloon portholes and deadlights, the culmination of a frightening storm. However, warmer, better weather eventually returned with the welcome sight of the Australian coastline.
And eventually their ship sailed up the Tamar River into the Australian town of Launceston, where Margaret's beloved Joseph and her 2 eldest sons were now living and working. And though the town was not very attractive to her, there at last she did meet Joseph and her 2 boys. And it was with true Quaker reticence that she remarked,
"It was a happy meeting, albeit in a foreign land."
And so the earth was no longer between Joseph Beale and his wife Margaret, the woman he loved most in the world. Shortly after their reunion, they decided to move to Hobart, the capital of Tasmania, where better prospects seemed to present themselves. So what occurred next? Bridie done.
When they arrived in Australia, life was very tough, all right. Margaret now found it very hard when she arrived because she went to Hobart, and Hobart was a convict colony. Now, Margaret was a very educated lady. She, wrote Greek and Latin, and she wrote poetry, and she made a little book one time for one of her children called A Little Book for a Little Boy. I just saw the cover of it. We have a picture of the cover. She was a lovely person. But when she got there, the first thing she did with her 2 older daughters was to open a school there. But later they left Tasmania and Hobart and went to Melbourne. I think she was a little bit happier there. But the sad part of it was that it was only 2 years later that Joseph died, and he was only in his early 50s. So they only had 2 years together out there.
And concerning Joseph Beale's unexpected early death, Dick Fitzpatrick shares his views.
When we heard that in that particular book that was written by Egger, that the father had died, it wouldn't surprise me. As I said, a worry alone would have tormented him so much that, yes, stress can cause a lot of diseases, as we know today. And I dare say that's what happened to him. And I think it was 4 years, 5 years he lasted out there, and that was all. But again, that was the Beale family. He was one of many families that went out there with the same longing to get back to Ireland.
And so it was that on Sunday the 14th of July, in the year of our Lord 1857, Joseph Beale, after attending a Bible meeting with a small group of fellow Quakers, complained of a pain in his stomach and went to bed. Within 13 hours he died quietly. And while Quakers are not given to epitaphs, nevertheless, if one were necessary, then Margaret Beale said all that was needed to be said when she later wrote the following.
"I humbly hope and trust his weary soul is now at rest after the many troubles he endured.
For it is true that if Joseph Beale had led a selfish life in his hometown of Mountmellick, in his native Ireland, then he would no doubt have been materially happy, and the ultimate desolation of Ireland's great hunger would have passed him by. The troubles of his later years began when he saw his modest fortune fretting away in aid of his fellow suffering compatriots. Maybe this was the tragedy of his life, or was it a quiet triumph? Dick Fitzpatrick.
It was a shocking, sad time, and when you look back on it, you know, you heard of the great people throughout the world that saved people. The Jewish community were saved by certain individuals. There was other people saved in various other cities throughout the world when there was disasters. The Beales done similar here in Mountmellick.
He knew himself he was a businessman. He knew that he was going out on a limb and that he was running himself into ruin. But at the same time, he couldn't stand by and see the people of the country and the poorer people and the people of the area, people that he knew and people who worked for him. He wouldn't stand by and see them starving to death. And as long as he had any money at all, and as long as the Quakers could help, they would help.
And so Margaret was a widow at the age of 46. When all Joseph's assets were realised, she had just enough capital to set herself up, along with her 17-year-old son William and her 2 elder daughters, in a grocery shop under the name of M. Beale and Son in Bridge Road in the peaceful Melbourne suburb of Richmond. Bridie done.
Now, she needed a sign over the shop, but at that time, women weren't supposed to be seen to be standing up on a ladder painting. So she got up early, very early one morning, and she masked herself quite a bit with sheets and things, and she did the sign over the shop. And by the time people started coming into the town, she had her name over the door, and she flourished there.
However, perhaps Margaret's true success story was the apple of her eye. Her last-born child, Octavius, who possessed his mother's wide-ranging intellect and classical scholarship.
She was very interested in education, and her greatest pride and joy was that her youngest son, who travelled with her to Australia, she was able to send him, Octavius, she was able to send him back to Mountmellick for his education. So he did that for the few years and returned to Australia. He was an extraordinary man as well. He was very interested in music and the arts, and also in industry. He started working firstly in a sewing machine factory, and later he went on to develop a piano. And a Beale piano at that time was like the Rolls Royce of pianos. You know, to have a Beale piano was like to have a Stradivarius and a violin or that. So he was very successful there, but he put a lot of his money into the arts and in music, and he started an orchestra as well. So he was a very educated, cultured man.
But I think one of the greatest stories of it was that young Octavius, the youngest son, Margaret, sent him back from Australia on the 90-day journey, which was a long journey and sail ship at the time, to get educated in the Quaker school, the Mountmellick here, the provincial school. And he undertook that journey to go back, got his education and went back to Australia. And Octavius is probably one of the greatest success stories in it, because he was a captain of Australian industry, and he was into the manufacturing of pianos, and his pianos were world famous. So it was a major success story.
They were the few, this is their song, who gave their all to right or wrong, that future generations might know about those who cared for Erin's woe.
So just how is Joseph Beale remembered nowadays in his native Mountmellick? Mountmellick local historian Ger Lynch.
In 2002, have a small commemoration ceremony to mark the 150th anniversary of the departure of Joseph Beale and his family. We had a small ceremony, a tree planting ceremony, and at which David Pym and some other people who were interested in the Beale family spoke.
And also in recent times, members of the Beale family have returned from Australia to Mountmellick to revisit their ancestral roots. County Laois local historian Dolores Dempsey.
I think they were very surprised and very proud that they were still remembered in Mountmellick, even though they had gone so long ago. You know, it's like people don't remember that far back, and families, even though they had records, but they didn't realise how important that their relatives had been in the, sustaining life in Mountmellick at the time around the famine. So they were very proud to be able to go around and visit the houses that are still standing here that their ancestors had left back in the 1800s.
Be not afraid to proclaim their deeds, the brave few answered others' needs. The countless victims unable to cope, they were the few warriors of hope.
And so we come to the end of our voyage of discovery into the remarkable life of Joseph Beale, who helped stave off hunger for many people in his native town of Mountmellick by keeping his mills operating as long as he could, when he could easily have averted financial ruin by closing them years earlier. This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. Songs by Cliff Wedgebury. And until our next number 6 programme in this larger 9-part Giving the Greatest Good series, from myself, Paul Wright, bye for now.
Joseph Beale will certainly be remembered for the work he did for the people of Mountmellick in those sad years.
They were very good people, particularly when it came to the time of the famine.
He knew that he was going out on a limb and that he was running himself into ruin, but at the same time he couldn't stand by and see poor people starving to death.
He was effectively put out of business, and he was effectively wiped out. His businesses were finished by the time the famine was over.
And as long as he had any money at all, and as long as the Quakers could help, they would help.
These people were really put their money where their hearts were.
When you look at the Beale family, they'll always be remembered in the town of Mountmellick.
They were very instrumental in saving a lot of people in the famine.
Farewell to thee, Mountmellick, dearest town to me. Even in our darkest hour of this land's history, for there are ties that bind me, even until death. It's here, my lovely village, my children first drew breath. Though I set sail far, far away, your fields and meadows forever stay, locked within my memory, like the turning tide of a restless sea. In bygone days I can recall sweet memories of youth, from childhood dreams to manhood scenes, you taught me gentle truth. Beneath your lofty slender spires and the glory of each day, I hold you ever in my heart, though you are far away. When I was in my manly prime, with love on you I gazed. With pride those memories linger still, and time will not erase the richness of your commerce. Flourishing to see the standing in this ancient land of your famed industry, until the grief of famine's hand cast its shadow far and caught us in its poverty, beneath grief's lonely star, above a broken village sad, where thatch had fallen through.